Good morning. Welcome to my living room. This is day two of our distance learning exciting activity, and I'm going to do my best today to illuminate just a couple of key principles about China's extraordinarily complex and somewhat obscure political regime. I should say one thing before we begin, which is that this is, I think, of the six case study countries in this course, the most complicated, the most difficult to understand political regime, because there's a really big difference between the way that it looks on paper and the way that it works in practice. So if you find yourself getting confused by the extraordinary number of acronyms and agencies and committees that do the same thing and have the same people on them, don't be disheartened. Don't feel bad about yourself. That's totally normal. Um, there are some ways in which I think the system is actually sort of thrives on confusing people. And so if you are getting a little bit lost in the muddle of organizations and of people and of acronyms, don't feel too bad. Don't get caught up in those particular details. The basic things that you need to remember are one, the party is more powerful than the state, and two, power is supposed to flow from bottom to top, but it actually flows from top to bottom. Those are the two principles that I think will help you keep China more or less straight in your head. Um, the key concept that you need to know in order to explain how Chinese politics works is organizational parallelism. That is the concept that there are basically two different kind of columns. If you did your government structures chart already, you should actually have two different columns going down most of the state institutions, because there's the official organs of the state that are supposed to serve the people as a whole, but then kind of next to them, behind them, and in some ways overshadowing them, are similar organizations that are under the control of the Communist Party of China. Um, in other words, for most things that the state does, the Communist Party also has a similar organization, and often the function of that organization on the party side is to direct or control or limit or constrain what that state institution does. So, in theory, on paper, depending which chunks of China's state constitution you read, the state is more powerful than the party. But in practice, the party is pretty much always more powerful than the state. Um, it's also the case that a lot of officials have multiple titles in China, and when they visit, say, the United States, they're acknowledged according to their state title. So Xi Jinping, for instance, is the president of China, and when he comes to the United States or when he has meetings with American politicians, he's greeted as the president. He is honored according to his state title. But it's not actually holding the presidency that gives Xi Jinping so much power in China. The most powerful position that he holds is general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party. And it's very common, going way down the line, to find um, that a person who looks powerful because they have an official state title representing the people is actually powerful because they also hold an official Chinese Communist Party title. Um, you want to watch out when you are swimming through the mess of organizations that is Chinese politics. One naming convention to pay attention to is that sometimes something will be called the party organization and sometimes something will be called the people's organization. So, most prominently, for instance, there are two big major legislative bodies in China. The state one is called the National People's Congress, and the party one is called the National Party Congress. They look kind of similar. They have some similar functions in that both are both sort of rubber stamp organizations that are supposed to, wield power on a higher ranking or wield checks over higher ranking institutions and people. But in practice, they kind of say yes to whatever it is that those higher ranking institutions and people want. Um, so watch out for that distinction between party institutions and people's institutions, which are usually state institutions. And unfortunately, that also means that if you refer to any body as the NPC, nobody will have any idea what you're talking about. One last thing, we'll probably spend some time later in this unit talking about how Xi Jinping, since coming to power in 2013, has changed China's institutions and amended China's constitution. But one thing to just highlight for now is that in 2018, coinciding with the start of his second term as China's president and as the CPC's, the Chinese Communist, or sorry, the Chinese Communist Party's general secretary, Xi Jinping supported successfully a constitutional amendment, which for the first time explicitly writes into the Chinese constitution a statement that I think we can read as saying that the party comes before the state. You can see that on your screen if you're interested, but I think it's just worth noting that under Xi Jinping's rule, China's constitution has started to make it more explicit that the party and not the state might actually wield all of the power. That's organizational parallelism. That's the most fundamental concept that you need to be able to grasp here. Um, I'm going to show you a simplified diagram of institutions on the Chinese state side. You can find a bunch of different diagrams with much more complexity, including, I think, in your textbook. But for the sake of simplicity, let's talk about the Chinese state institutions in this kind of abbreviated form. Number one, um, China, unlike the other case study countries that we've done so far, China has a system in which the legislature holds pretty much all the power. Um, and again, I'm talking in principle, I'm talking on paper, I mean, just on the state side before we consider the influence of the party. But staying just on the state side for now, the legislature in China checks the executive, the legislature checks the judiciary, but those other two branches of government don't really have a lot of formal constitutional powers to check the legislature. Um, China is, to state the really, really obvious, a huge country, both geographically and numerically. And so there are a bunch of different kind of layers of local, provincial, and national legislatures working from the bottom up. Um, it is commonly said that China has, China is by no means a democracy, and so we commonly assume that it doesn't have elections, but that's not technically accurate. There are, at the most local level, in rural areas and in cities and towns, there are elections at the lowest level of the legislature where citizens do get to vote for members of their what's called the local people's congresses. And the organization and the names vary a little bit depending on whether you're in a village or a rural area or an urban area, but there's no need to particularly get into that. Beyond that most local, at lowest level of the legislature, though, China then has indirect elections. So the members of a rural district people's congress will then elect a number of people to go on to the provincial people's congresses. And then members of those people's congresses in China's provinces will go on to elect about 2,000 people who go on to the National People's Congress. And China's constitution, again, on paper, vests basically all the authority of the state, basically all the power of the state in that National People's Congress. So on paper, this should be the single most important institution in China. The NPC, the National People's Congress, I should say, then goes on to select the executive. So they choose the president and vice president. There is no direct election of executives in the Chinese system. The president gets to nominate the premier, which is equivalent to a prime minister. And in principle, the president's the head of state, the premier or prime minister is the head of government. So in principle, the president should be kind of detached from the day-to-day affairs of the state, whereas it's the premier who should be managing the bureaucracy and managing the cabinet and so on and so forth. The premier, in turn, is confirmed by the National People's Congress. So that's a way in which they can theoretically exercise some checks on the president. And the premier gets to nominate members of the state council, which is the equivalent of China's cabinet. That state council then oversees China's vast, vast bureaucracy. Finally, the National People's Congress gets to choose members of an organization called the Central Military Commission, which is in charge, theoretically, of China's very large military apparatus. But as with almost everything in China, it turns out that the Communist Party is going to have its own institution that's actually calling the shots. One other thing that I wanted to talk about on the state was to get into a little bit more detail about China's judiciary, because a theme running through this course, I hope, has been that you need to pay attention to the independence of the judiciary and the powers of the judiciary and the historical behavior of the judiciary in order to understand how democratic a state is. In China's case, as I said earlier, there is no principle of separation of powers. It's really a separation of functions. So the judiciary, the courts, the police, the prosecutors are supposed to carry out all the judicial functions of the state, but they are in principle responsive to, they are under the supervision of the National People's Congress. So there's a clear principle that the legislature is superior to the judiciary. There is no judicial review in China. They have no formal power to strike down laws. The National People's Congress would presumably be responsible for that. Um, But I think it's worth noting that the rule of law in China, the idea that there should be, written codes that everybody has to follow, has increased by most external measurements as China's economy has liberalized. And that's a pretty common trend that you see with economic liberalization, which is that in order to attract foreign investors, you have to guarantee them some sort of security for their property, some sort of security for their employees. And so countries that are seeking foreign direct investment, as China did in the 80s, 90s, and today, um, tend to reinforce the rule of law, at least as it applies to business practices and the treatment of foreigners. That said, the judiciary, somewhat like what we see in Russia, is very much an instrument of state power. And in China in particular, the judiciary, of course, tends to be pretty responsive to the wishes of the Communist Party. So I've laid out a system on paper in which the Chinese state should be, the most important set of institutions wielding power in society. But I want you to just consider these three facts and think about whether, in point of fact, whether in reality, the state is actually the supreme institution. Those facts are first, 95% of high level bureaucrats or civil servants are members of an organization called the Chinese Communist Party. The second is that never in history has the National People's Congress voted down a proposal that was supported by the Chinese Communist Party. It's never happened. And then the third is that Xi Jinping holds the most powerful state office in China, or at least the highest ranking, which is president. Simultaneously, he has two other jobs. He is also the general secretary of the Chinese Communist Party, and he's the chairman of China's Central Military Commission. So you might use those as pieces of evidence to support the contention that maybe there is an institution which wields at least as much power as the Chinese state.